Alright everyone, so breaking news, but during the 2019 Gamescom opening night livestream with Jeff Keighley, Sony just casually tweets out that they have officially acquired Insomniac Games after a 20-plus year working relationship with the studio. So this is actually really big news. If anything, more surprising news would be the better way to put it, but it is official, so this was actually posted on Insomniac's blog. This is from directly the Insomniac CEO, Ted Price, who was quoted as saying on the blog, "Today we announced that Insomniac has a new home as we join the Worldwide Studios family at Sony Interactive Entertainment. It feels more like a homecoming, though. We've collaborated with Sony for more than 20 years, spanning all 4 PlayStation consoles, 20 total games, and 6 franchises. We still work closely today with many of the same Sony teammates as we did when we released the original Spyro the Dragon in 1998. The decision to join the forces with Sony extends far beyond familiarity. Our studio vision is to create experiences that have a positive and lasting impact on people's lives. As we look ahead to our future, we know that joining the Worldwide Studio family gives us the best opportunities to fully achieve the vision on a much larger scale. Further, we believe that Sony shares a similar vision to positively impact players' lives, their employees' lives, and the games industry at large." And he really goes on to say more about the studio's growth and evolution and whatnot, but this is really surprising. We have to look at all the different avenues of what really happened here because, well, we discussed this maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago that, well, what developers is Sony possibly going to buy? Because they've been vocal about this. They've said on 2 or 3 occasions now they want to acquire more developers in terms of going into the next generation for their overall strategy with that platform is to get more bigger budget studios, to do more AAA games, work with second parties, big publishers, mind you. They're really going all in on these high caliber games that they've been well known for in the past 4 or 5 years now, even extending further than that, 10 plus years now. That's really Sony's image right now when it comes to their exclusives and their developers, and so they're going to pursue that even further. But we discussed in that video what developers would Sony possibly acquire, and in that video I read off Insomniac Games based on their history with what they've been doing with Sony. I mean, yes, there's a 20-plus year working relationship, but it's actually been on record numerous times throughout those 20 years that Sony has, in fact, tried to acquire Insomniac, and Insomniac consistently says no. We don't know the details of how many times they've been offered, what has been offered. I mean, these are all behind the scenes, board meetings, phone calls, things like that. We don't know that stuff, but Insomniac has always said no. They've wanted to be independent, and they've even had a period of time where they did go independent and they did pursue different things. This is when they were doing Fuse being published by EA. This is when they went to Microsoft for Sunset Overdrive. So they really have done some different things lately. This is also a situation where Ted Price at one point said, you know, we're not going to revisit Resistance anymore. That story's over. Then kind of retracted that and said, you know, never say never. So of course things change, and certainly that's the case here. But what has changed? Why did Insomniac get acquired now? I mean, what was really different? Well, I think right now it's in a situation where Sony finally offered the right amount of cash, but also what has recently transpired, which is that Spider-Man did incredibly well. I mean, phenomenally well. I mean, the game has sold so many units, and this is the biggest superhero game that has been out so far. It's one of the fastest selling PS4 games available. It's one of those things where no doubt we're going to get another Spider-Man on PlayStation 4 and 5, or maybe they'll just go straight all into PS5 entirely based on starting development now on the sequel. But Insomniac is also a developer that can do multiple games. They can usually have 2 big projects going at the same time, or they can put everybody assigned to one big project, but generally they can do a few things at one time, so we can expect another Spider-Man for sure, and we've been expecting another Spider-Man based on how well it did. But that's the thing, is that when you have an IP like that did so well, Insomniac can't walk away from something like that and say, oh, we're still going to stay independent. Now, Spider-Man is under the Sony IP, much like many of the games that Insomniac has done over the years, whether it's Ratchet or Resistance. I mean, these are Sony intellectual properties, so even if it wasn't Insomniac developing these, Sony could field it out to another developer. Now, they're not going to do that. Sony understands the importance of having the original developer do it, or make sure that it's taken care of in a really good way, where they work closely with the original source developer and collaborate to figure out the best way to go about continuing that franchise. That certainly takes place, but Sony's had a pretty good track record of doing something like that, so they wouldn't carelessly hand off Ratchet somewhere else or Resistance if they were to revisit that franchise. No, I mean, they want to go about it in the best way possible. So I think this was just really good timing for not only Sony offering a probably exorbitant amount of cash, but Insomniac finally realizing, you know, the history's there. You know, we went and did our own thing, which let's be honest, didn't really work out for them. Fuse was pretty much their worst game that they ever released, and that was when they were working with EA. Now, EA is just publishing the game. You know, they're providing funding for the game, marketing dollars, things like that. So really, a lot of the responsibility on how Fuse came out to be probably mostly fell on Insomniac, unless EA kind of intervened over and over again to say, hey, put this in the game, do that, do this, because that's the thing, is that publishers do have that say when they're providing all the dollar. But then they went to Microsoft with Sunset Overdrive, and that necessarily wasn't a bad game. A lot of people really enjoyed Sunset Overdrive, and we'll be talking about that in a second, where it's like people want Sunset on PlayStation 4 now. So it is a franchise that people really enjoy, but Insomniac going with Microsoft, a lesser platform, seeing that deal probably wasn't very favorable to them, and realizing that it just makes a lot more sense to finally be acquired by PlayStation. And it's one of those things where it does really work out for them when they do have that working relationship. I mean, when they've been making all these IP for Sony, I mean, it's a certain point I think you really have to consider actually going for it now after what you've done previously, which didn't really pan out all that well. So there we go. Insomniac officially part of Sony Worldwide Studios. Now, what can we expect moving forward? Definitely another Spider-Man, but what would be that other franchise, right? Whether it's a new IP or revisiting an old Sony franchise that Insomniac's well known for, like Ratchet or Resistance. There's a lot of ways it can go. I certainly don't have a concrete answer, but I think the timing was now right. And so this is the first real public acquisition that Sony's been vocal about. We know that there is more coming. It's not just Insomniac. Sony said more developers or organically creating new ones. We have murmurings of a new team coming out of San Diego, and so whether that is just all lumped into one studio and they never really talk about who that is, or they finally formally announced that unannounced project and then the brand new team working on that project, and you have to imagine that is going to happen eventually. We'll find out what the whole deal is there, but that's an organic studio being made for that project. Might be a rumored Uncharted from what we're hearing. But anyway, over on Twitter, I asked you guys if you have any questions for me to answer. I will do so on video, and as always, follow on Twitter at Mystic Ryan if you want updates on the channel, pictures of my cat, and situations like this. So we're going to start off with Edwin. He says, Sony will inevitably add more studios following this to stay competitive with AAA, but what studios will you consider to be a likely follower considering this unlikely acquisition due to its stubbornness previously? Yeah, I mean, when you see something like this, you think there's a lot more possibilities than what we were previously theorizing. I still think Remedy's a really safe bet right now. Anything else at this point, I don't even want to say because it seems like a total shot in the dark. You never know what's going on behind the scenes. Rob O'Donnell says, do you think the next Spider-Man could be a PS5 launch title? No chance. They just pumped out the game last year, and even though they've got all these assets built, I mean, there's not going to be a fast enough turnaround. PS5 is probably going to launch holiday 2020. That means they've only got like a 2-year development cycle. They obviously weren't working on a sequel concurrently with the first game, so you're not going to see another Spider-Man for a pretty long amount of time. Stop eating bugs. This cat is eating a moth. Why would you do that? Don't look at me like you don't know what you're... Look at this. Hold on. Because everyone wants her in the videos. She's batting around a moth right now. What are you doing? Arsenal ZA says, what do you want to see from Insomniac more? New IPs, sequels to current ones, or old IP reboots? I want to see another Resistance for sure. I think a lot of people would also like another Ratchet and Clank, and I think Ratchet's one of those games where they don't need to put a whole lot of people to that project. It's not really a game that demands that large of a team. I mean, you can go all in on Ratchet and make something incredible, but I think you can have a pretty a smaller group within Insomniac to work on another Ratchet. But I would honestly like to see them go all in on a true Resistance 4, and I don't want it to be a reboot. I want them to continue the story. I want them to show us what Resistance looks like on the latest hardware and do some really ambitious stuff like Resistance 2 where you were doing these massive multiplayer lobbies. I want to see them get creative, and that's what I loved about Resistance, is that it was Insomniac at I think one of its most creative times, so I would love to see more Resistance. Angry Coin said, why don't women talk to me? That's a loaded question. You really have to figure that out on your own. I can't answer that for you. This is a really good question. Nova Prospect says, why acquire Insomniac now, considering they've been a strong second-party studio for 20 years? That's what I've really been thinking about for the last hour after this was announced, which is that it's big news, it's surprising news, but part of me thinks this didn't really need to happen. They've been a second-party studio. When you've got these IP like Spider-Man, Resistance, and Ratchet, and Sony owns them and they can do what they want with them, did they really have to shell out all this cash to make sure that they are stuck with PlayStation? that's where I'm kind of like, I'm not 100% seeing the deal just yet make a whole lot of sense. I mean, yeah, they're locked down now. Insomniac's going to be making some great PlayStation content, and they can be, well, for Insomniac at least, it's a thing that they can sleep easy on now, knowing that they've got funding for all their projects, that they're going to be taken care of. I mean, that's the thing about being acquired by somebody like Sony. You have, as a developer working at the studio, I mean, you've got a sense of security now, that you've got your marketing dollars, you've got your funding, you've got your creative freedom. So I think it makes a lot of sense for Insomniac, especially now. But for Sony, I'm not 100% sure. I'm sure there's a lot more to it, and I think Sony's got more plans for Insomniac well beyond what they've been working on the past few years, but for right now, that's kind of how I'm feeling about it. Laser Lauren 23 says, do you think Sony will try to make any changes to Insomniac's next project, or do you think they will let the studio have complete creative freedom? Definitely creative freedom for sure. That's just what Sony's been known for, especially in the last decade or so, with them doing so well with their exclusives and working closely with studios. Is time and time again, from all these different parties, they've always said that they have the freedom to do what they want and explore all these different gameplay mechanics or features or stories. Generally, that seems to be the case. I'm sure there's still a lot of input from Sony, and we do have to understand there's a vested interest in these developers that are working with Sony. They can't necessarily say bad things about them, but it just seems like one of those things where it comes up so frequently, you have to figure that it's true what they're saying, is that Sony does let people really flesh out their project the way that they want to do so. Mysterio says, will we get Sunset Overdrive? Really the only Xbox game I wish I could play. So we'll cover the Sunset question. A lot of people are asking that. We'll lump this all together. The thing about Sunset Overdrive is that it was a pretty unique situation for Insomniac, and that this was the time period for them where they wanted to stay independent, but they did do a second-party release. However, the deal and the actual contract, from what we know, is that it's specifically for the first game. So this is when Insomniac wanted to retain their IP, which they do. Sunset belongs to Insomniac Games. However, that first game is locked with Microsoft on Xbox One. We don't know the exact deal of that contract, how long it lasts, if it's in, you know, unlimited perpetuity. We don't know that. But at the very least, we know that Insomniac has Sunset, which means that Sony now has Sunset. So in theory, yes, Sony could release a sequel to Sunset Overdrive or a spin-off. They could use that universe. They can't touch the first game right now, but maybe there could be a scenario where, with enough time passing or working out a deal with Microsoft to break that contract, maybe that could happen. I don't know if it's really worth Sony to do something like that in terms of another Sunset actually coming to PlayStation or Insomniac working on more Sunset. I would say it's unlikely right now, given what Sony could have them do that's not Sunset. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's franchises that are much more meaningful and larger than Sunset, and because it's an unfamiliar franchise to PlayStation fans, I don't know if it makes a whole lot of sense to do more of that on PS4 and PS5 onward. So as of right now, with Sunset, I think I wouldn't get your hopes up to see more of it. My buddy Nick Believe It says, we won't know for a while, of course, but hopefully they make some PSVR games. Watch as they're still allowed to work with Oculus or something. Not necessarily a question, but yeah, I see where you're coming from. Yeah, I mean, they're a big studio, so they can work on a few things at one time, whether it's a big budget game or the smaller stuff. I mentioned that earlier. I don't know if they would do PSVR stuff. You imagine that if that was a high interest or a high priority on Sony, they would have them do something like that. I think it would be a situation where Insomniac would have to approach Sony and say, hey, we want to try some PSVR stuff. I don't think Sony would put that on Insomniac. They've got London studio to do some VR stuff. I think there's better developers and better situations for them to get more PSVR content instead of having Insomniac work on it. I think it would only make sense if Insomniac approached first and said, hey, we've been doing, you know, some of this VR stuff already. Let's do some PSVR stuff as well. You know, so that's kind of how I feel on that. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I don't want this to get too long, but yeah, we're really starting to see some next-gen stuff really come together, which is great. It's always exciting to have this stuff really start to heat up a little bit. Gamescom, we got some great Death Stranding footage, which we're not going to discuss here. We'll save that for Friday and Let's Talk PlayStation, but I am glad this came up because I didn't really have a video ready for this coming Wednesday, so that works out fine. We won't have anything on Wednesday, and I'll see you guys on Friday for Let's Talk PlayStation. As always, if you haven't yet, of course, please subscribe for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates that are here on YouTube. You can still follow on Twitter at Mr. Grind for scenarios just like this, or pictures of Melissa. She's right there. She's licking herself. That's lovely. And that's it. So I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.